The hallways of the music academy were almost empty that afternoon. Most of the students had already gone home, and the usual noise of instruments and voices had faded away. The long corridor felt calm and quiet, with only the faint sound of footsteps echoing from time to time. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows and stretched across the polished floor, giving the building a peaceful, sleepy feeling. Inside one of the offices near the end of the hallway, a music professor was finishing his work for the day. Papers were stacked neatly on the desk, and a few music books were open beside them. He had spent many years teaching piano and music theory, and most days followed the same routine. Classes in the morning, lessons in the afternoon, then grading assignments before heading home. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes for a moment. It had been a long day. Teaching music required patience, and sometimes students struggled with the smallest details. Some forgot their practice, others rushed through pieces without feeling the music. After so many years of teaching, surprises had become rare. He gathered a few papers, placed them into a folder, and stood up. Outside the window, the sky was slowly turning warm with the colors of late afternoon. It was the kind of quiet moment that made the entire building feel almost peaceful. Just as he reached for his coat, something unexpected caught his attention. A sound. At first it was very faint, almost like a whisper carried through the hallway. He paused and listened more carefully. A piano was playing somewhere in the building. That was not unusual by itself. After all, it was a music academy. But something about the sound made him stop completely. The notes were soft, but they carried a strange kind of depth. It was not the careless playing of a beginner pressing keys randomly. The melody moved slowly, gently, as if someone understood exactly what each note should feel like. He stood still for a few seconds, listening. The music continued. There was something emotional in it, something thoughtful. The kind of playing that made a person pause without even realizing it. He stepped out of his office and closed the door quietly behind him. The hallway was nearly empty. The sound of the piano floated through the corridor, bouncing softly off the walls. It was coming from the practice rooms farther down the hall. Normally the practice rooms were used by students during the day, but by this time most of them were already locked or empty. He walked slowly in the direction of the music, curious now. As he moved down the hallway, the sound became clearer. The melody was not simple. The player was moving through the notes with confidence, letting some linger while others flowed quickly into the next. The professor frowned slightly in confusion. Most of the advanced students had already finished their lessons earlier in the day. He tried to think of who might still be practicing at this hour, but no name came to mind. He continued walking step by step. The piano sound grew stronger as he approached the practice rooms. A warm melody filled the quiet space, echoing softly through the corridor. It was not loud, but it was powerful in its own way. Whoever was playing seemed completely focused. There were no pauses, no awkward mistakes. The music moved naturally, like a conversation. The professor slowed his steps. Something about the playing felt unusual. He had spent decades listening to students practice, and he could usually recognize skill levels within seconds. Beginners struggled with rhythm. Intermediate players followed the notes carefully but often lacked emotion. But this sounded different. This sounded personal. He reached the last corner of the hallway and noticed that one of the practice room doors was slightly open. A narrow line of light stretched across the floor from inside the room. The music was coming from there. He walked closer, careful not to make noise. For a moment he simply stood outside the door and listened. The melody shifted into another section, deeper and more emotional than before. The pianist pressed the keys with gentle control, letting the notes breathe between each phrase. The professor's eyes narrowed slightly in concentration. This was not the playing of someone casually practicing scales. This was someone telling a story through music. He gently pushed the door open a little more. Inside the small practice room sat a young boy at the piano. The professor stopped moving. The boy looked no older than 12. He sat on the bench with his back straight, his eyes focused on the keys. His fingers moved carefully but confidently across the keyboard. There was no sheet music on the piano stand. The boy was playing completely from memory. For a moment, the professor simply watched in silence. The young student didn't seem to notice the open door. He was completely lost in the music, leaning slightly forward as his hands moved across the keys. The melody grew softer again, almost thoughtful. The professor felt a strange sense of surprise. He did not recognize the boy from any of the advanced classes. In fact, he couldn't remember seeing him in the academy's main performance groups at all. Yet the way he played suggested years of careful practice. The professor leaned quietly against the doorframe, listening. The music slowed near the end of the piece. The final notes were gentle, almost like a quiet sigh. The boy held the last chord for a moment before letting the sound fade into silence. For a few seconds, the room was completely still. Then the boy noticed someone standing near the door. His head turned quickly, and his hands pulled away from the piano keys. His eyes widened with surprise. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, standing up from the bench. His voice carried a mix of nervousness and respect. "I didn't know anyone was still here." The professor stepped into the room slowly. "That's all right," he replied calmly. The boy looked a little embarrassed. He glanced at the piano as if wondering whether he had done something wrong. "I was just practicing for a few minutes," he explained quietly. "I didn't mean to stay too long." The professor looked at him carefully. "You were playing that piece just now?" The boy nodded. "Yes, sir." The professor glanced at the piano again, still thinking about the melody he had heard in the hallway. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. The boy hesitated slightly before answering. "I just practice when I can," he said. The answer sounded simple, but the professor knew there had to be more to the story. He walked closer to the piano and gently touched one of the keys, letting a single note ring softly through the room. "You've had lessons here before?" he asked. The boy shook his head. "Not really," he said. "Sometimes I just come into the practice room when it's empty." The professor looked at him again, more carefully this time. The boy didn't look like someone trying to impress anyone. His expression was calm, almost shy. Yet the music he had just played told a completely different story. For the first time in a long while, the professor felt something he had not felt during a normal day of teaching. Genuine curiosity. He pulled a chair closer to the piano and sat down. "Would you mind playing that piece again?" he asked gently. The boy looked surprised. "You want me to play it again?" The professor nodded. "Yes." The boy slowly sat back down on the piano bench. His fingers rested lightly on the keys as if he were thinking for a moment. Then he began to play again. The same melody filled the room once more. But this time the professor listened even more carefully. Every note carried emotion. Every phrase felt thoughtful. And as the music continued, the professor realized something that made him freeze in quiet amazement. This young student was not just playing notes. He was feeling the music in a way that many trained musicians struggled to understand. And in that quiet practice room, the professor knew he had just discovered something extraordinary. The small practice room felt even quieter the second time the music began. The young boy sat carefully on the piano bench, his fingers resting lightly on the keys for a brief moment before he started playing again. The professor sat only a few feet away, watching closely this time. He was no longer just listening to the melody. Now he was studying every movement, every pause, every small detail in the way the boy played. The notes flowed smoothly, just as they had before. But hearing it again made the professor notice even more things that surprised him. The boy's hands moved naturally across the keyboard. There was no hesitation when he shifted from one section of the piece to another. His fingers curved gently, landing on the keys with the kind of control that usually came from years of practice. Yet there was still no sheet music in front of him. The professor leaned slightly forward in his chair. That detail alone was unusual. Most young students depended heavily on written music. Even talented ones often kept their eyes moving between the page and the keyboard. But this boy never looked anywhere except at the keys. It was as if the music already lived in his mind. The melody grew softer in the middle of the piece, and the boy slowed his playing slightly, letting each note settle before moving to the next. His shoulders stayed relaxed, and his expression looked focused but calm. He did not seem to be performing for anyone. He simply seemed to be enjoying the music. The professor crossed his arms quietly as he listened. He had spent most of his life around pianos. He had watched hundreds of students learn their first scales, struggle through difficult passages, and slowly grow into confident performers. But something about this moment felt different. The boy was not showing off. He was not rushing to finish the piece. Instead, he played with patience, almost as if he respected every single note. The professor noticed something else as well. The boy occasionally changed tiny details in the melody. A note would be held slightly longer. A soft pause would appear between two phrases. These were not mistakes. They were choices. The professor's eyebrows lifted slightly. Those small decisions were signs of interpretation, something musicians usually developed much later after years of studying music deeply. Yet this young student seemed to understand it naturally. The piece moved toward its final section, the melody slowly building in emotion before gently returning to a calm ending. When the final chord faded into silence again, the room became still. The boy lifted his hands from the keys and looked toward the professor, unsure what to expect. For a few seconds, the professor did not say anything. He simply looked at the piano, thinking carefully. Finally, he spoke. "How long have you been playing?" The boy shifted slightly on the bench. "I'm not exactly sure," he said quietly. "A few years, maybe." "A few years?" the professor repeated. The boy nodded. The professor leaned back in his chair again. "That piece you played," he continued. "Where did you learn it?" The boy glanced down at the keyboard before answering. "I heard it online once," he said. "I liked the sound, so I tried to play it." The professor blinked slowly. "You learned it just by listening?" "Yes," the boy replied simply. The professor was silent for a moment. Learning music by listening was not impossible. Some students developed strong musical ears and could repeat melodies after hearing them. But repeating an entire piece like that, with emotion and structure, was something far less common. He studied the boy more carefully now. The student looked calm, but also a little nervous, as if he expected to be told that he should not have been using the piano. "You said you come here when the room is empty," the professor said. "Yes, sir," the boy replied. "Why not take regular lessons?" The boy hesitated for a moment. "I just practice on my own," he answered. The professor noticed the careful way the boy spoke. His words were polite but short, as if he did not want to explain too much. Still, the professor could sense that the boy's connection to music was real. He tapped his fingers lightly against the side of the chair while thinking. Then he stood up and walked toward the piano. "Let's try something," he said. The boy looked up, curious. The professor placed a few loose pages of sheet music on the piano stand. The paper was slightly worn, filled with notes and markings from previous students. "This is a different piece," the professor explained. "Have you seen it before?" The boy leaned forward slightly to look at the music. He shook his head. "No, sir." "That's all right," the professor said calmly. "Just take a look at it." The boy studied the page quietly. His eyes moved across the notes slowly at first, following the lines carefully. The professor watched his reaction. Some students immediately looked confused when they saw unfamiliar music. Others tried to play quickly without really understanding what they were reading. But the boy did neither. He simply examined the notes with quiet concentration. After about a minute, he placed his fingers on the keys. The first few notes came out slowly. The boy paused briefly between them, making sure his hands were in the correct place. Then he tried again. The melody started to form. It was not perfect yet. A few notes were uncertain, and the rhythm was careful rather than smooth. But something important was happening. The boy was figuring it out. He was not guessing randomly. He was reading the music and translating it into sound step by step. The professor folded his arms again, watching closely. After a short while, the boy played the first section more confidently. His fingers moved more naturally now, and the rhythm began to flow. He made one small mistake, stopped, and then corrected it without looking frustrated. That detail made the professor smile slightly. Many students became nervous when they made mistakes in front of a teacher. But the boy treated it like a normal part of learning. He simply tried again. The second attempt sounded much better. The melody continued across the keyboard, slowly gaining shape. The professor felt something he rarely experienced during ordinary lessons. Excitement. Not because the piece was difficult, but because of how quickly the boy understood it. He was not just copying notes. He was listening, adjusting, and improving with every attempt. After a few minutes, the boy stopped playing and looked back at the professor. "Was that okay?" he asked. The professor did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the other side of the piano and looked directly at the sheet music. Then he looked at the boy. "You've never taken formal lessons?" he asked again. The boy shook his head. "No, sir." The professor slowly nodded. He had spent decades teaching music, but moments like this were rare. Very rare. Because sometimes, once in a long while, a teacher encountered a student who seemed to understand music in a way that could not easily be explained. And sitting in that quiet practice room, the professor was beginning to realize something important. The boy at the piano was not just another student practicing after school. He was a hidden talent that almost no one had noticed. And if the professor had not stopped in the hallway when he heard that melody drifting through the building, he might never have discovered it at all. The quiet practice room felt different now. The earlier nervousness had slowly faded, but the air was still filled with a strange kind of curiosity. The professor stood beside the piano, looking at the sheet music that still rested on the stand. The boy sat on the bench, waiting politely, his hands folded together as if he did not want to touch the keys again without permission. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The professor had many questions in his mind, but he did not want the boy to feel uncomfortable. He had taught long enough to know that talent often appeared in the most unexpected places. Sometimes the most gifted students were not the loud ones or the ones who tried to impress everyone. Sometimes they were quiet and unnoticed, sitting in the corner of a room, simply doing what they loved. He finally pulled the chair a little closer and sat down again. "You said you practice here sometimes when the room is empty," the professor said gently. The boy nodded. "Yes, sir. How often do you come here?" The boy thought for a moment before answering. "Whenever I can," he said. "Usually after school." The professor tilted his head slightly. "You come here alone?" "Yes." The boy's answer was simple and honest. There was no sign that he thought it was unusual. The professor looked around the small room for a moment. The piano stood quietly in front of them, its polished surface reflecting the soft light from the ceiling. "Do you have a piano at home?" he asked. The boy shook his head. "No, sir." The professor paused. "No piano at all?" "No," the boy replied. That answer made the professor even more curious. "So where do you practice?" The boy looked at the keys again before answering. "Sometimes here," he said. "Sometimes at school if the music room is open. And sometimes I just listen to music and try to remember it." The professor leaned back in his chair. "You remember it?" The boy nodded. "I listen carefully," he explained. "Then later I try to find the same notes on the piano." The professor studied his face carefully. The boy did not say it like it was something special. To him it seemed normal. But to someone who had spent a lifetime teaching music, it sounded remarkable. Learning by listening required a strong musical ear. But remembering entire melodies and recreating them without guidance was far more difficult than most people realized. "How long have you been doing that?" the professor asked. The boy thought for a few seconds. "I think since I was about 7, he said. 7? "Yes." The professor folded his arms again. "That's when you first started playing?" The boy nodded slowly. "I used to hear music at a community center near my home," he explained. "There was an old piano there. Sometimes people played it." "And you watched them?" "Yes," the boy said. "I liked the sound. I would stand nearby and listen." The professor could almost picture the scene in his mind. A young child standing quietly in a corner while someone else played music. "What happened after that?" he asked. The boy smiled a little, remembering. "One day no one was in the room," he said. "The piano was just sitting there." "And you tried it?" The boy nodded. I pressed a few keys. The professor chuckled softly. That's usually how it begins. The boy laughed a little too. At first it didn't sound very good, he admitted. But I kept trying to find the notes I remembered. And you kept practicing after that? Yes, the boy said. His voice carried a quiet excitement now, like someone remembering something important. Whenever the piano was empty, I would sit there and try again, he continued. Sometimes I stayed only a few minutes, sometimes longer. The professor listened carefully. Did anyone teach you what the notes meant? The boy shook his head. Not really, he said. I just tried to remember the sounds. The professor looked down at the keyboard again. That explained why the boy played with so much feeling. He was not thinking about rules or technical instructions. He was simply following what his ears told him. Do your family members play music? The professor asked. No, the boy replied. Do they know you play the piano? Yes, the boy said. They know I like music. The professor noticed the way the boy spoke about it. There was no pride in his voice, no attempt to make his story sound impressive. He spoke about music the way someone talks about a favorite hobby. But the professor knew there was something much deeper happening here. Natural musical talent like this was rare, very rare. The professor stood up and walked slowly around the piano, thinking carefully. Then he stopped beside the window. Outside, the sun was beginning to lower in the sky. The soft light made the hallway outside the room look even quieter than before. After a moment, he turned back toward the boy. Why do you like the piano so much? He asked. The boy looked surprised by the question. He stared at the keys for a moment before answering. It feels like a voice, he said softly. The professor blinked. A voice? Yes, the boy explained. When I press the keys, it feels like the piano is speaking. The professor smiled slightly. That's a beautiful way to describe it. The boy shrugged a little. I don't know how to explain it better, he said. You explained it very well, the professor replied. The room grew quiet again for a moment. The professor looked at the boy with growing interest. He had met many students who practiced hard, but very few who spoke about music with such natural understanding. It was clear that the boy did not see the piano as just an instrument. To him, it was something alive, something meaningful. The professor slowly returned to his chair. Would you like to learn more about music? He asked. The boy looked up quickly. Yes, he said without hesitation. The professor nodded thoughtfully. That's good, he said. Then he glanced at the piano again. Because I think you have something special. The boy looked confused. Special? The professor smiled. Talent, he explained. The boy looked down again, slightly embarrassed. I just like playing, he said quietly. The professor knew that was true, but he also knew something the boy did not yet realize. Hidden inside that simple love for music was a rare ability that could grow into something extraordinary. And at that moment, the professor began to feel something important. Responsibility. Because sometimes, when talent appears in front of a teacher, it becomes their job to help guide it. He looked at the boy again and said calmly, Would you be willing to come here again tomorrow? The boy's eyes lit up with quiet excitement. Yes, sir. Good, the professor replied, because deep down he had already made a decision. He wanted to learn more about this young pianist. And he had a feeling that this quiet meeting inside a small practice room might be the beginning of a journey neither of them expected. The next afternoon, the music academy was much busier than it had been the day before. Students walked through the hallways carrying instruments and music folders. Some hurried toward their lessons, while others gathered near the lockers, talking and laughing before class. The sound of different instruments practicing filled the building. Violins warming up, a trumpet playing scales somewhere down the hall, and the steady rhythm of a drum in one of the larger rooms. Inside his office, the professor sat quietly at his desk, but his mind was not on the papers in front of him. Every few minutes he glanced toward the clock on the wall. He kept thinking about the boy from the previous afternoon. The memory of that unexpected music still stayed with him. Over the years he had heard many students play, but something about that moment had felt different. The way the boy listened to the notes, the way he explained music as if it were a voice, it had left a strong impression. The professor had spent most of the night thinking about it. Not everyone who loved music became a great musician, of course. But sometimes a person appeared with a natural understanding that could not easily be taught. And when that happened, it was important not to ignore it. He checked the clock again. It was almost the same time as yesterday. The professor stood up, straightened a few papers on his desk, and walked into the hallway. Students were moving in both directions now, and the building felt alive with energy. He walked toward the practice rooms at the end of the corridor. As he turned the corner, he saw someone already standing outside one of the doors. The boy. He stood quietly near the wall with a small backpack over one shoulder. He looked patient but slightly nervous, as if he was not sure whether he had arrived too early. When he noticed the professor approaching, he stood a little straighter. "Good afternoon, sir," the boy said politely. "Good afternoon," the professor replied with a warm smile. "You're right on time." The boy nodded. "I came as soon as school finished." The professor unlocked the practice room and pushed the door open. "Come in," he said. The room looked the same as the day before. The piano stood quietly near the center, and a few chairs were arranged along the wall. Sunlight streamed through the window again, lighting the keys softly. The boy stepped inside and placed his backpack near the chair. The professor walked over to the piano and gently lifted the lid. "Before we start," he said, turning toward the boy, "I'd like to try something with you today." The boy nodded quickly. "Okay." The professor placed a new sheet of music on the piano stand. The pages looked more complicated than the ones from the previous day, filled with clusters of notes and changing rhythms. "This piece is a little more challenging," the professor explained. "Don't worry if it feels difficult at first." The boy leaned forward and studied the page carefully. His eyes moved slowly across the notes. The professor watched him closely. "What do you see?" he asked. The boy pointed at the first line of music. "It starts softly," he said, "and the notes move upward here." The professor nodded slightly. "That's right." The boy continued studying the page. "Then it changes here," he added, pointing to another section. "The rhythm becomes faster." The professor smiled. Many beginner students looked at sheet music and only saw confusion. But the boy was already noticing patterns. "All right," the professor said. "Try the first part." The boy sat down at the piano bench and placed his fingers on the keys. For a few seconds he did nothing. He simply looked at the notes again, as if he were quietly imagining how the music might sound. Then he began to play. The first few notes came out slowly and carefully. He paused between them, making sure his hands were in the correct positions. A couple of notes sounded slightly uncertain, but he kept going. The professor remained silent, standing beside the piano. He wanted to see how the boy approached a new challenge. The melody began to take shape. After the first line, the boy stopped and tried again from the beginning. This time the rhythm sounded smoother. The professor noticed something interesting. The boy was not frustrated by mistakes. Instead, he seemed curious about them, as if each error helped him understand the music better. After a few minutes, he reached the faster section. His fingers hesitated slightly at first. Then he tried again. The second attempt was better. The professor folded his arms thoughtfully. That was when he decided to make the exercise a little harder. "Stop for a moment," he said gently. The boy lifted his hands from the keys and looked up. "Yes, sir." The professor closed the sheet music and turned it over so the notes could no longer be seen. "Now," he said calmly, "try playing the first part again." The boy blinked in surprise. "Without the music?" "Yes." The boy thought about it for a moment. Then he nodded. He placed his hands back on the keyboard. The first note sounded. Then the second. The melody returned slowly, almost exactly as he had played it before. The professor watched closely. The boy was remembering the music. Not perfectly, but clearly enough to continue the piece without looking at the page. After a short time, the professor raised his eyebrows in quiet amazement. The boy had only seen the music once, yet he could already recall most of it. When the melody ended, The room fell silent again. The boy turned toward the professor. "Was that right?" he asked. The professor did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and looked outside for a moment. Students were crossing the courtyard below, unaware of what was happening in the small practice room above them. Finally, he turned back toward the piano. "You have a very unusual way of learning music," he said. The boy looked uncertain. "Is that bad?" The professor shook his head quickly. "No," he said with a small smile. "It's actually very special." The boy looked relieved. The professor walked back toward the piano. "Music isn't just about reading notes," he explained. "It's also about hearing, feeling, and understanding what those notes mean." The boy nodded quietly. "And you seem to do that naturally." The boy looked down at the keyboard again. "I just listen," he said. The professor smiled again. "Yes," he said. "You do." For a moment the two of them simply stood there, looking at the piano. Then the professor spoke again. "Tomorrow evening the academy will hold a small rehearsal in the main hall," he said. The boy looked up. "A rehearsal?" "Yes," the professor explained. "Some students will be practicing for an upcoming recital." The boy listened carefully. "I would like you to come and watch," the professor continued. The boy's eyes widened slightly. "Really?" "Yes," the professor said. "It will be a good chance for you to hear other musicians and learn from them." The boy nodded eagerly. "I'd like that." The professor closed the piano lid gently. As he looked at the young student standing in front of him, he felt more certain than ever about one thing. The quiet discovery he had made in the hallway the day before was only the beginning. Because sometimes a single moment of music could reveal a future no one had expected. And the professor had a strong feeling that the boy sitting at that piano was just getting started. The next evening the music academy looked very different from its usual quiet self. The main hall was filled with soft noise and movement as students prepared for rehearsal. Chairs were arranged in neat rows facing the stage, and several instruments rested on stands nearby. Some students practiced small sections of their pieces, repeating difficult parts again and again. Others sat quietly, reviewing sheet music while waiting for their turn. The professor stood near the front of the hall, speaking with another teacher about the rehearsal schedule. Every now and then his eyes moved toward the entrance. He was waiting for someone. A few minutes later, the doors at the back of the hall slowly opened. The boy stepped inside. He looked around carefully, taking in the large room and the many students gathered inside. It was clear that he had never been part of something like this before. The sound of different instruments playing at the same time made the room feel alive. For a moment he stood near the door, unsure where to go. Then he noticed the professor near the stage. The professor raised a hand and waved him over. The boy walked slowly down the aisle between the chairs, his eyes moving from one musician to another. Some students were tuning their instruments. Others were quietly practicing scales on their pianos set up along the sides of the room. When he reached the front, the professor greeted him with a friendly smile. "I'm glad you came," he said. "Thank you for inviting me," the boy replied politely. The professor pointed toward a chair near the front row. "You can sit there and watch the rehearsal." The boy nodded and sat down. From his seat he could see the entire stage. A large piano stood at the center, shining under the lights. It looked bigger and more impressive than the practice room piano he had been using. The boy watched quietly as the rehearsal began. One student walked onto the stage and began playing a classical piece on the piano. The notes filled the hall clearly, echoing softly across the high ceiling. After finishing the piece, the students stood up and nodded toward the teachers before returning to their seat. Another student followed, this time with a violin. The boy listened carefully to every performance. He noticed how each musician played differently. Some focused deeply on their sheet music, while others closed their eyes and let the melody guide them. The professor watched the boy from across the room. What impressed him was not just the boy's interest, but the way he listened. He leaned forward slightly during certain parts of the music, as if studying the sound carefully. After several performances, the professor walked over and sat beside him. "What do you think so far?" he asked quietly. The boy smiled. It's amazing, he said. Everyone plays so well. The professor nodded. They've practiced for many years. The boy looked back toward the stage where another pianist was finishing a performance. I like how the music fills the whole room, he said. That's one of the beautiful things about performing, the professor replied. The rehearsal continued for nearly an hour. One by one, students performed short pieces while the teachers gave gentle advice and encouragement. Finally, there was a short break. Students stood up, stretching and talking quietly with their friends. Some walked toward the hallway for water while others stayed near the stage discussing their performances. The professor stood up and turned toward the boy. Would you like to come with me for a moment? He asked. The boy looked surprised but nodded. They walked together toward the stage. When they reached the piano, the boy hesitated slightly. The instrument looked even larger up close. The polished surface reflected the bright lights above them. The professor gently opened the piano lid. A few nearby students noticed and looked over curiously. Go ahead, the professor said softly. The boy blinked. Me? Yes. The boy looked around the hall. Several students were now watching. I don't know if I should, he said quietly. The professor placed a reassuring hand on the edge of the piano. Just play something simple, he said. The boy slowly sat down on the bench. For a moment he did nothing. His hands rested in his lap while he stared at the keys. The room had grown quieter as more students noticed what was happening. The boy took a deep breath. Then he placed his fingers on the keyboard. The first notes came out softly. At first, the sound was gentle and careful, as if he were testing the instrument. But soon the melody grew stronger. The notes began flowing naturally, moving across the keyboard with smooth confidence. Students who had been talking nearby slowly turned their attention toward the stage. The music filled the hall in a warm, emotional way. Some students exchanged surprised glances. The boy continued playing, completely focused on the sound. He did not look at the audience or worry about their reactions. His eyes remained on the keys as his hands moved through the melody. The professor stood quietly beside the piano. He had heard the boy play before in the small practice room, but hearing the music in the large hall felt different. The sound carried farther. Every note seemed to float across the room. A few more students gathered closer to the stage. By the time the boy reached the middle of the piece, nearly everyone in the hall had stopped what they were doing. The music was no longer background noise. It had become the center of attention. When the final notes faded away, the room stayed silent for a moment. Then someone softly clapped. Another student joined in. Soon the entire room filled with applause. The boy looked up in surprise. He had not expected such a reaction. The professor smiled proudly. You see, he said quietly. The boy stood up slowly from the bench, still looking slightly shocked. One of the students stepped forward and said, "That was really good." Another nodded in agreement. "Where did you learn to play like that?" The boy looked toward the professor, unsure how to answer. The professor simply smiled. "Natural talent," he said calmly. The students looked impressed. As the applause faded and the rehearsal prepared to continue, the professor knew something important had just happened. For the first time, others had heard what he had discovered in that quiet hallway days earlier. And now it was clear to everyone in the room. The boy's music had the power to stop people in their tracks. And this moment was only the beginning of something much bigger than any of them had expected. After the applause slowly faded, the room returned to its usual rehearsal atmosphere, but something had clearly changed. Students who had been talking casually before were now looking at the boy with curiosity. Some whispered quietly to each other, still surprised by what they had just heard. The boy stepped away from the piano bench slowly. His face showed a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He had only meant to play a simple piece, just as the professor suggested. He never expected the entire room to stop and listen. The professor gently closed the piano lid and looked at the boy with a calm smile. "You did well," he said. The boy nodded quietly. "I didn't know everyone would watch," he admitted. "That's what happens when music connects with people," the professor replied. They stop what they're doing and listen. The boy looked around the room again. A few students were still smiling at him. One even gave him a small thumbs up before returning to their seat. For someone who had mostly practiced alone, this moment felt very new. The professor placed a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. "Come," he said. "Let's sit for a moment." They walked down from the stage and returned to the front row of chairs. The rehearsal soon continued with the next student performing, but the boy found it difficult to focus at first. His mind kept replaying the moment he had just experienced. The sound of the piano in the large hall felt very different from the small practice room. Every note had traveled across the entire space. Every pause had been heard. After the rehearsal ended later that evening, students slowly began packing their instruments. Some left the hall quickly while others stayed behind to talk with friends. The boy stood beside the professor near the stage. A few students walked past and gave friendly nods. One said quietly, "You should play again sometime." Another added, "That piece sounded beautiful." The boy thanked them politely, still a little shy. Once most of the room had cleared, the professor turned toward him. "How did it feel?" he asked. The boy thought for a moment. "It felt bigger," he said. The professor smiled slightly. "That's a good way to describe it." The boy looked back at the piano on the stage. "When I play alone, the music stays in the room," he explained. "But here it felt like the sound was traveling everywhere." "That's the power of performing," the professor said. "Music becomes something people share." They began walking slowly toward the exit. Outside the hall, the hallway lights had grown dimmer as the evening continued. The building was becoming quiet again, just like it had been the afternoon when the professor first heard the mysterious melody drifting through the corridor. As they walked, the professor spoke again. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "moments like tonight can change a person's path." The boy looked up. "What do you mean?" The professor stopped walking and faced him. "Talent is only the beginning," he explained. "But when talent meets opportunity, something special can happen." The boy listened carefully. "I've taught music for many years," the professor continued, "and every once in a while, I meet someone who hears music in a very natural way." The boy looked down slightly, unsure how to respond. "I believe you have that gift," the professor said gently. For a moment the boy did not say anything. Then he asked quietly, "What should I do?" The professor smiled. "The same thing you've already been doing," he replied. "Keep listening, keep playing, and keep learning." They reached the front doors of the academy. Outside, the evening air felt cool and calm. Streetlights glowed softly along the sidewalk, and the sky had turned dark blue. The boy placed his backpack over his shoulder. "Thank you for letting me play today," he said. "You're welcome," the professor replied. He paused for a moment before continuing. "I would like to give you regular lessons here," he said. The boy's eyes widened. "Really?" "Yes," the professor answered. "I think you deserve the chance to grow your talent properly." The boy looked surprised and grateful at the same time. "I'd really like that," he said. The professor nodded. "Good. Then we'll start soon." They stood there quietly for a moment, both thinking about the future. The professor remembered the first moment he heard the piano in the hallway. At that time he had only followed the sound out of curiosity. Now he realized how important that moment had been. If he had simply gone home that afternoon, he might never have discovered the young musician practicing alone behind that half-open door. Sometimes life changed because of very small decisions. A pause in a hallway, a melody heard from a distance, a door opened at the right time. The boy began walking toward the sidewalk, then stopped and turned back. "I'll practice a lot," he said with determination. The professor nodded proudly. "I know you will." As the boy walked away into the evening, the professor remained near the academy entrance for a few seconds. Inside the building, the hallways were quiet again. But this time the silence felt different, because the professor knew that somewhere in the near future, the sound of that piano would fill those halls again. And the next time people heard it, they would not be surprised by a hidden talent. They would be listening to the beginning of a remarkable musical journey. All because one day a professor heard a 12-year-old student playing the piano and stopped to listen.